those difficulties which a person encounters on immigration when he arrives to the country where he arrived. This is the moment where he has closed the door behind him. All the other problems that come ahead are the stressors: documentation, family members, his culture. These are all the obstacles that he's going to have after he has left home. To all that we call stressors. Of course, we are going to talk about stressors above all for those that are a risk to mental health, because we're evaluating mental health. That is the objective. As I mentioned before, these are evaluated independently for each one. Where we have the language one, the work, the social status. These could be different one from the other. So we utilize the same system. Simple stressors, small difficulties that everyone has. Nobody arrives to our country and everything is all done for them. The richest person in the world, it's not that way. The person doesn't know the language, there's difficulties. If one arrives in good conditions, then the person overcomes that easily. The complicated stressors would be when the immigrant is bound with the previous problems, he's working overtime, the structure of the family, all these type of situations are difficult, but with effort he's able to overcome them. And we will call these stressors extreme ones. Those that the immigrant he cannot control, they are tremendous walls, big walls that will affect him psychologically. We are talking clearly about the undocumented. These are walls, big walls that difficult them to learn the language, to progress to a social level. We will talk about that later with more detail, like we mentioned earlier. Then we're going to talk about the indicators, the criteria, to see when we will consider a simple situation or a complicated situation. At the very bottom, the whole scale is based in 2 or 3 ideas that are repetitive. And once these understand the basic idea, then it's very easy to understand. We have here the scale, how it is used, and we can see the 7 griefs. In each grief, we are going to have to evaluate what vulnerability does the person have, and what stressors this person has to confront in the country that he has gone to. Valued as simple, complicated, and extreme. And those are the 7 griefs. One can understand the image, basically. Some aspects of which we will talk about. We've talked about observations. 4 things that the scale doesn't measure, but that we will try to acquire through observation. Why does the scale doesn't measure everything? Because if it did measure everything, then it wouldn't be scientific. You'd have like a magic bar or something like that. The scale cannot measure all of reality. It will measure aspects that we consider that are significant. And if you could do that, that's a lot. Science cannot measure everything. We cannot do it. So it is important to see where are the areas that the scale doesn't measure. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to take them into account. We will try everything. We will do an observation so that when we do the global evaluation of this immigrant, we see the whole thing of the situation of this person. Now we will explain it with more detail. Now we have to talk about the small wording, the indicators. How do we measure that reality of the patient? When it's simple, when it's extreme, we will try to do an example so you can understand it. The indicators are of reality that help us with the evaluation of these elements of vulnerability in relation to the stressors. So then we have in these elements of vulnerability and stressors, the vulnerability stressor, there's the physical one, diseases, limitations, physical limitations that the immigrant has. A man that migrates with a heart problem or different disease, these are physical problems or diseases, but we're also going to see this mental disability. The person has a phobia. All this is vulnerability. We are also going to see the history that the person has had, because it's not the same thing. It's not the same person that comes from a life without difficulties to a man that comes from a country in war where he has led violence, threatening and dangerous. All this has affected him in some way. So from the theories that I have mentioned earlier, all of that is vulnerability. That's why I have insisted so much in explaining these theories, because I limit myself to theories. In back of me, I have all this conceptual information that allows me to do this. The people that had lived traumatic experiences, very hard times, this leaves a scar. So you could call this vulnerability. And so these are the indicators of the scale. What do we measure in the indicators of the stressors? There are the personal stressors of the person when it comes to family or friends. Fundamentally, social stressors. What difficulties does the person have in the work environment, culturally, etc.? Which are these walls? I think a stressor would be like a wall, difficulty to have success in life. We are talking about something extreme. So then, I will give you an example that is very clear. Let's talk about the language. There are 7 griefs, but I will give you an example of one of the griefs. And let's talk about the language grief. I think it's very important. You will be able to see it more clearly. Vulnerability to the grief in regards to language. What are we measuring? Because we want to make sure what is it that we're measuring. We have to go back to the manual to see what we're measuring. We are measuring only. It's not a little thing, but that's what it is at the moment. The limitations that the person has, the limitations of the subject that he had before migrating that could make preparing for migratory grief difficult are assessed. Well, that's all we were measuring. Before migrating, this person had some difficulty, some problem, but then when he migrates, this could hinder his success when it comes to language. So what would be vulnerability? Simple vulnerability. In a physical level, small limitations, linguistic limitations that we all could have. Some people cannot pronounce the R very well or the S very well. We understand each other, communication, or psychologically. There are people that they have friends, they have relationships, but they are not the kings of the party either. They communicate in some way, in a moderate way. All that is simple vulnerability. With that, being that the case, the person could have success when that person goes to another country when it comes to the language of the country that they went to. So we go back to the chapter of vulnerability, complex vulnerability. Let's talk about it. Let's say this person has a problem with hearing. Maybe the English, phonics, a little bit different from Spanish, to learn English. Eyesight problems, to be able to read. All these are difficulties to have success in general work. But if that person found in a favorable environment, instead of learning something in 4 years, maybe it'd take them 9 years, but it's not impossible. Just on a psychological level, the person that migrates with depression, with social phobia, with certain mental disability, it's going to be hard, but the person can accomplish it with the resources, with patience. The person will learn the language. Some people will migrate with dyslexia or other medical problem. The language, so this person needs more attention, but it's not an impossible thing to have success in the new change. We could also take into account people that have lived very difficult situations in personal story. Maybe a child that has lived in a very violent environment. Maybe he's limited cognitively. We could also consider that as complicated vulnerability. And then a person migrates being very old, maybe 80 years, changing a language somewhat complicated. Nothing comes in. One doesn't learn. The neurons don't work the same for so much. That would be complicated vulnerability. But if he puts effort, he could also learn. So what's extreme vulnerability? It's a person that migrates in extreme situations. This is going to be an enormous handicap to be able to have success. As an example, maybe the person doesn't hear absolutely nothing. The person has an accident that involved his brain. The cognitive part is going to be hard. There's going to be impossibilities. Or psychologically, mental disability, very extreme. This would hinder any type of learning. So are you understanding this? How the scale picks up all this. Reality situation in relation to the immigrant. So then you have the simple and complicated. And so then you mark according to what characteristic you see, and we will continue. There would be the social grief. The person migrates with the problem with the heart will have limitations to work. Well, the person that is healthy, the person would be able to work. But a person who has a heart problem, any day he could die. There's simple vulnerability. There's the simple one, the complicated one. Hard problems, but they could be overcome. And then there's vulnerability, the one that is extreme. It's the type that you can't even go forth one more step. So now we're going to see this immigrant, how the scales measure once he gets here. He's here now. Now we're going to see when he has arrived. So which would be the stress factors that the person lives, and how do we identify these? You're going to be measuring the obstacles that this person has in relation to the learning the English and understanding this new language. What would be simple stress factors? Small limitations that have always existed in the means to be able to do this change. Nobody has 24 hours, like the professor that speaks English or the friends, and slowly the person will learn the language. The simple stressors would be that the conditions are not perfect. This would be not only to a family level, to a social level. What are these complicated stressors? Maybe he doesn't know the English. He works so much. It's really difficult for him to learn the language. Works many hours in a place that he doesn't learn English, he doesn't have time to go take classes, and he doesn't put effort because he's tired. But if he puts effort, what are these extreme stressors? We are talking now about an immigrant that has these walls that will hinder contact.
He works all day. He is full of fear. He is scared. He cannot attend the school courses because they will be asking for documentation. Therefore, we are talking about an external reality that is limiting the immigrant for him to be successful. So we are talking about really